Thank you very much. I invite you all to stand as you are able. The whole this morning is according to John, the 11th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, See how he loved him? But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. And when he said this, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. I place before you today what I believe are to be 3 truths. The first is that death and grief are constant companions in our lives. Number 2, both have the ability to help us grow and to be transformed. And finally, number 3, God's presence and grace is in each moment of this reality. Poet John O'Donohue speaks especially to these first 2 truths quite eloquently in a blessing he has written called For Death, and I share it with you now. From the moment you were born, your death has walked beside you. Though it seldom shows its face, you still feel its empty touch when fear invades your life, or what you love is lost, or inner damage is incurred. Yet when destiny draws you into these spaces of poverty, and your heart stays generous until some door opens into the light, you are quietly befriending your death, so that you will have no need to fear when your time comes to turn and leave. That the silent presence of your death would call your life to attention, wake you up to how scarce your time is, and to the urgency to become free and equal to the call of your destiny. That you would gather yourself and decide carefully how you now can live the life you would love to look back on from your deathbed. It's ironic, but the presence of death helps us to live now a life of greater meaning. And its intrusion into our lives often results in transformation of us. Sometimes it happens when we escape a bout with serious illness or undergo a delicate surgery, and we wonder, why have we been given more time? Sometimes it's the preciousness of looking at a life that's been given a timeline, and we put all of our attention into completing a bucket list or into savoring each moment as gift. Other times, it's when death comes to call, and we fall into a depth of sadness that is greater than we ever thought possible. Or we have to confront the sudden absence and resulting loneliness head on, and it seems insurmountable. Or it happens in the loss of a pandemic, as we are confronted with what it means to work, to gather, to care for each other, to do and to be church, or to live into whatever the new reality is that is breaking in. Wherever and whenever we enter this thin space, that place where heaven and earth seem to draw close, we are always brought up short to wonder about how are we living out our calling? What is the work that is still before us? And we always find ourselves grappling with the possibility of still living, even in great pain and loss. You see, to grieve is to live. To grieve is to prepare for resurrection. To grieve is to find resurrection already present in this life. Because to grieve is to live into our relationship with Jesus Christ. And it is to recognize the power of life over death. And it is to find a sliver of hope that is just enough to sustain us in our sorrow. To grieve is to live fully in the now, even as we prepare ourselves for a life of eternity. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. There's no roadmap that we can follow. Think about how grief is expressed by Mary and Martha as they wrestle with the death of their beloved brother. Martha was the first one to confront Jesus with those words, "Lord, if you had only been here." But true to her personality, she wasn't afraid to ask for reassurance. And she also said to Jesus, "I know God will give you whatever you ask of him." And when Jesus promises resurrection, she clings to the promise of eternity. Martha keeps her emotions in check, but she reaches deep and down into her faith to find comfort. On the other hand, Mary speaks those same words, "Lord, if you had only been here." But the grief that is present in her is overflowing with emotion, and any words of reassurance have no meaning for her in that moment. Her tears of despair affect everyone around her, including Jesus. And then there is the anger of grief. Now, some translations simply say Jesus is greatly moved or disturbed, but others attempt a closer translation, and it gets at being very agitated or groaning with a great discomfort or even being angry. And this is the emotion that's coming from Jesus. From Jesus, even as he knows what he is about to do. Even as he has said over the last several days, "I'm going to raise Lazarus from the dead." He is angry. Is he angry at the reality of grief? Or at what he knows will be a misinterpretation of his actions? Or is he angry at death itself? Whatever his reason, we too have known anger in our grief. Just as we have known overwhelming sadness, just as we cling to the words of promise, just as we do so many things to try and change the reality of death. Just as we gather here today, not only to remember and to celebrate the lives of those who we have loved and have lost, but also as we continue to grieve those losses, whether it's a loss of the past year or the loss of almost a lifetime ago. Grief remains, and death does not disappear. But in the midst of it all, we are reminded over and over that life always overcomes death. We remember that Jesus did not promise to keep people from dying. He did not promise to prevent suffering or grief itself. But he did promise to raise the dead. He promised, and he does, offer us relationship and abiding with God. And he has gifted us with a grace and a peace that always overcomes death and despair. This is resurrection. And it is resurrection that can comfort us in our sorrow, strengthen us in our exhaustion, and show us how to live each and every moment under God's precious care and nurture. And in the promise of resurrection, in that reality, we once again remember how to live. Sometimes we change course, or we reorder our priorities, or we start to savor things like the gift of time, or the wonder of the world, or the binding of relationships. And somehow, as terrible as it is, we can even find ourselves giving thanks for death. For without death, there can be no resurrection. Last week, I was introduced to the poet Rosemary Waltola Trommer. She's been writing a poem a day and putting it out on social media for the last several years. But this past August, she began living into one of those most horrific kinds of grief when her 17-year-old son died by suicide. Since then, she's been writing from the depths of her sorrow. And I close today with one of the poems that she wrote about a month ago, and it is titled, How. I do not know how beautiful grief could be, how generous, like an improvised cello sonata in a minor key, a melody that leaps and wails, unfurls into harmonic bloom and makes the whole body tremble. There is a purity in it, a sweetness that says, you are here and I will hold you as long as you meet me. When others tell me they wish they could take some fraction of the pain, I thank them, and I mean it, but I would not let them take even the tiniest portion. To meet grief is to be deeply steeped in love. It is to know the self as wildly alive, tugged apart by beauty, by loss. And grief draws its bow across the strings of the moment, sonorous and lyrical. Oh, this sensuous rush of the world. And how is it, through tears, through ache, through breathtaking pain, I find myself saying thank you.